The evening Miriam Hartley walked into the midsummer ball at Ashvale, she already knew she was leaving. She had dressed carefully, for that reason, in the pale gray silk she had pressed herself, the one gown she owned that asked nothing of the room and gave nothing away. The candles in the long gallery burned in their silver arms above 100 glittering guests, and the music from the quartet at the far end arrived in warm, rolling waves across the marble floor. Miss Philippa Vane stood near the tall windows in white muslin and seed pearls, her dark hair arranged in a coil that caught every candle near her, and she was laughing at something Lady Dorothea Calder had said. Lady Dorothea herself sat in the carved chair she preferred at all Ashvale entertainments, the one position so that she could see every doorway at once, her ivory fan at the precise angle she used when she was satisfied. Miriam read that angle correctly. She had been reading Lady Dorothea for 2.5 months, and she understood now that the fan's angle was a thermometer. When it climbed toward the dowager's collarbone, something was being managed. Tonight it rested just below her chin, still and certain. The declaration was as good as made. What Miriam did not yet know was that Edmund Calder, the Duke of Ashvale, had been watching the doorway since 9 o'clock, and that she was the one he was watching for. She had arrived at Ashvale in early May with a portmanteau and a letter of introduction from her father's old friend, Mr. Larch of Bath, and £30 a year agreed upon for teaching his ward, Clara, to play the pianoforte. The estate had appeared in the morning rain as something deliberate and old, its stone the color of charcoal where it met the sky, its gardens laid out in formal symmetry that seemed to resist the season rather than welcome it. She had been shown through a side entrance by Agnes Webb, the housekeeper, a compact woman with the bearing of someone accustomed to managing very large things with very small gestures, and Agnes had looked at Miriam's portmanteau and her plain dark cloak and said without any particular inflection, "You'll do." It was the kindest thing anyone would say to her for a fortnight. She had taken the position because Silas needed it. Her brother was 17 and enrolled at a respectable school in Exeter, and the fees outstanding amounted to £60, a sum that had seemed manageable when their father was alive and seemed now like a wall with no door in it. She had interviewed for 3 other positions before this one. A lady's companion to a woman in Bristol who asked her to read aloud for 6 hours a day and had the face of someone who would eventually require one to apologize for breathing. A schoolroom post in Suffolk that paid £22 and included a note on the door warning against bringing personal correspondence into the East Wing, and then Mr. Larch's letter, and £30, and Ashvale. Clara was 8 years old and had the particular quality of grief that installs itself in a child's shoulders before it reaches their face. She had been in her guardian's household for 3 years, since her parents died of a fever that swept through their village in a single bad winter, and she played the pianoforte with genuine feeling and almost no technique. Miriam sat beside her at the instrument in the music room each morning, and found to her own surprise that she was glad of the work. Clara's fingers were small and serious. She listened carefully. When she made an error, she did not flinch from it. She simply located it and played the phrase again. Miriam recognized the quality and said nothing about it because she had learned early that naming a virtue directly will often cause a child to perform it, rather than simply possess it. The Duke of Ashvale she met at dinner on her 3rd evening at the estate. He was taller than she had expected from Agnes's description, which had been entirely procedural and had not included height. He was perhaps 34, with the kind of face that had been organized by years of not letting things cross it. A jaw that appeared to have been placed there as a structural feature rather than an expression of character, and dark eyes that moved across a room with the particular quality of someone accounting for everything and remarking on nothing. He sat at the head of the table. He was perfectly civil. He said at the point in the meal when the topic of Clara's progress arose, "Miss Hartley, I trust you are finding the instrument adequate," and Miriam said she was, and that Clara had a genuine ear, and that in her opinion the child's previous instruction had rushed the fingering exercises, and that if she could suggest a slower, methodical approach to the scales before they returned to the repertoire pieces, she believed they would see improvement within 6 weeks. He looked at her for a moment as though she had placed an object on the table he had not expected to find there. Then he said, "I engaged you to teach the child, Miss Hartley. I am confident you need no direction from me on how to proceed," and returned to his conversation with the estate solicitor at his left. It was said without heat and without cruelty. It was the kind of dismissal that is all the more complete for having no anger in it, the sort that treats a suggestion not as wrong, but as unnecessary. Miriam received it without expression, drank her water, and said nothing further about the scales. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her room on the upper floor, the one with the window that looked north over the formal parterre, and she listened to the house settle around her and told herself the practical facts of her situation. £30 a year. £60 owed for Silas. She needed 2 years at minimum, unless she could find a way to send more. She was not going to find 2 years at Ashvale by making herself inconvenient to the man who paid her wages. She filed the conversation away under the heading of useful information and went to sleep. Agnes Webb brought her tea each morning before Clara's lessons began, not as a formal gesture, but as a habit that established itself without discussion. And it was Agnes who told her, on the third morning, that Clara had not slept well as a child before Miss Hartley came. "She plays the old pieces over in her head," Agnes said, setting the cup down with the efficiency of someone who made cups of tea into small architecturally sound things. "You can hear her sometimes, very early. But she's not doing that. This week." She did not elaborate. She gathered her things and left, and Miriam understood that the information had been offered as a kind of accounting, that Agnes Webb kept her own ledger of what the house needed and who was providing it, and that Miriam had been entered into it. Edmund dismissed her counsel a second time in July. They were standing in the library, she and Edmund, with the morning light coming through the long south windows, and Clara's name between them like a piece of furniture that had not yet been placed correctly. Miriam had asked with care and in the appropriate tentative register whether Clara's schooling might be considered more formally in the coming year. She had worded it exactly as she had practiced it, not as a request, but as an observation. There was a school in Bath, she said, that had a strong tradition of encouraging genuine musical ability alongside the regular curriculum, and that Clara's ear and her capacity for patient work would serve her very well there. She had written to the school already, she mentioned, and had received a prospectus. She produced it. She set it on the library table between them. He looked at it. He did not pick it up. "I do not believe," he said, "that Clara is ready for an institution of that size." He paused for a moment, and she thought for one odd second that he might say something further, but instead he said, "I appreciate your concern for her progress," in a tone that made appreciation sound very much like the end of a road, and turned toward the window. Miriam looked at the prospectus lying on the table, and then at the back of his coat, and then at the prospectus again. She was aware of something rising in her, not anger exactly, but the adjacent feeling, the one that has more dignity in it. She picked up the prospectus. She said calmly and with the careful precision she employed when she most wanted to be precise, "She is ready, Your Grace. I have been teaching her for 8 weeks. I know what she is capable of rather better than those who observe her occasionally at dinner." The words arrived in the room with a weight she had not entirely planned for. He turned from the window. His expression did not change. She did not wait for his response. She folded the prospectus, said good afternoon, and withdrew. She walked back through the corridor to the music room and sat at the pianoforte bench alone for several minutes, not playing. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was aware that she had spoken truly, and that it had almost certainly cost her something. She was also aware, distantly, that she could not quite bring herself to regret it, and that this was either a virtue or a great inconvenience, and she had not yet worked out which. It was Lady Dorothea who sharpened the picture into clarity. The Dowager arrived at Ashvale in the second week of June, announced by a traveling coach with the Calder Arms on its door, and accompanied by Miss Philippa Vane, whom she introduced at the drawing-room tea that first afternoon as the daughter of her own great friend, Lady Vane of Wiltshire. Miriam was present at this tea, in the capacity in which she was usually present at Ashvale's social occasions, which was to say at the margin, seated near the window with her cup and her silence. Lady Dorothea noticed her, after a pause that was itself a communication, and said, "Ah, yes, the music teacher," with the warmth one might employ when identifying a useful piece of furniture. And then to Miss Vane in a voice calibrated for the room rather than for the conversation, "We engaged a provincial girl to manage the pianoforte lessons. Very adequate for the purpose." Miss Vane had the manners not to look. She smiled at something one of the footmen was arranging near the tea things and said softly, "How sensible." And that was all. And it was quite enough. Miriam set down her cup with the steadiness she had been practicing since she was old enough to know that steadiness was something you could practice. She thought about Silas and Exeter, about the £60, about the 2 years she needed at minimum. She thought about Clara's hands on the keys, small and serious, playing the phrase again. She said good afternoon to the room and withdrew before anyone had asked her to. She had not been there when Edmund came in from the East Garden some 20 minutes later and found his mother arranging Philippa Vane at the pianoforte, having her play the instrument as a demonstration of some private point. He had said, Agnes told her much later, "Where is Miss Hartley?" And his mother had said, "Oh, I'm sure she has her own occupations." Agnes had been crossing the corridor with the tea things, and had heard it, and had noted it in her ledger without being invited to do so. She told Miriam only weeks later, after the reversal, and Miriam absorbed the information with the stillness of someone who has received an unexpected account of something that had already changed the whole arithmetic of a situation. The fever came to Clara in the 3rd week of June. It came in the night, as fevers in children often do, arriving without warning and settling in with a stubbornness that alarmed Agnes and frightened Miriam, and sent the housemaid for the physician before the clock had reached 11. The physician came, examined Clara, prescribed a cold compress and careful watching, and said that she would recover in 3 days provided her temperature did not climb further. He left. Agnes arranged the nursing rotation. Miriam said she would take the first watch and found when 2 o'clock came, and then 3, and then 4, that she could not leave the room. Clara was not distressed, only hot and small and intermittently awake, and when she was awake she wanted the stories. Not her book specifically, but the telling of them, the sound of a voice in the dark that was doing something particular. Miriam told her the story of the princess, who taught herself to navigate by the stars when her compass was taken from her. She told her the one about the girls who built their house out of music, because stone was too expensive. She told them in the low, careful voice one uses at 4 in the morning in a sick child's room, not to entertain, but to anchor. She did not know Edmund was standing in the doorway until much later, until it was already too late for the knowledge to be the kind of information she could fold up and use practically. Agnes told her that he had stood there for perhaps a quarter of an hour, perhaps more, watching through the half-open door while Miriam sat beside Clara and told her stories in the dark. That he had not entered, that he had not spoken, that he had eventually turned and walked quietly back down the corridor toward his own rooms, and that his face when he did had the quality of someone who has seen something that has adjusted permanently, and without permission, the way he understands a particular thing. Miriam, of course, did not know any of this. That night, she stayed until dawn. Grayed the window, and Agnes came to relieve her. She went to her room and slept for 4 hours in her day dress, and when she woke, she washed her face and went back to see how Clara was getting on. It was in the garden the following week, when Clara was recovered and walking a little in the afternoon sun, that Edmund's wound became visible to her for the first time. He had come out through the east gate of the formal parterre, not looking for her specifically, she thought, moving with the efficiency of a man crossing from one obligation to another. He stopped when he saw Clara walking with Miriam along the gravel path, and something in his posture shifted, very slightly, in the way a held thing shifts when a grip is adjusted. He came toward them. He crouched down to speak to Clara at her own level, a thing Miriam had not seen him do before, and he asked her whether she had been frightened in the night, and Clara said she had not, because Miss Hartley had told her stories, and Edmund looked up from Clara's face to Miriam's with an expression that was not the closed, organized expression he kept at table and in the library. It was something 3 degrees more open than that, and it arrived and departed so quickly that she almost believed she had imagined it. He stood. He said, "I am glad you are well, Clara," and continued toward the stable-yard. Miriam watched him go. Then she looked down at her own hand, which was still holding Clara's, and noticed that she was holding it rather more firmly than she had been a moment before. She adjusted her grip and said nothing. That evening, passing the library door on her way to her room, she saw him through the partly open door. He was seated at the library table with the lamp burning low, not reading, one hand resting flat on the leather surface, and the other at his coat pocket, and he was looking at something small he held in his palm. She did not stop. She kept walking. She had seen enough to know it was a portrait miniature, the kind set in a gold oval with a clasp, and she had seen enough of his face in the lamplight to understand that whatever it contained was not a pleasure, but a wound. She went to her room and lay on her bed in the dark, and thought about the quality of grief that organizes itself into a man's posture over 6 years, and how she had read it as coldness, and how she had been entirely wrong. The next morning she encountered him in the corridor before Clara's lesson, and he said, with what appeared to require some effort, "Miss Hartley, I trust Clara is entirely recovered." "She said she was." He said, "She speaks well of your instruction." He said it looking at a point somewhat past her shoulder, which was his method, in moments she was beginning to understand were not cold at all, but careful. She said she was glad, and then, because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving the honest thing unsaid, she said, "She is rather more than adequately ready for the school in Bath, Your Grace." I would not have said so if I had not been certain. She was not certain. He heard the second sentence. He had already moved past her, and his expression had given nothing away, which she was beginning to suspect was his version of giving away a great deal. Agnes Webb took her aside that afternoon, leading her with the purposeful casualness of someone who has something to say, and intends to say it in a location she has chosen in advance. She guided Miriam to the still room, which smelled of dried lavender and cloves, and was currently empty, and she said in a voice that carried the authority of 22 years in the house, "The Dowager intends to have Miss Vane announced at the midsummer ball. She intends for it to look like his Grace's own preference. You should know this." She paused. "I am telling you this because the house will be better for knowing it too." She gathered a cluster of dried stems from the hook above the shelf and left before Miriam could form a response. Miriam stood in the still room for several minutes after Agnes's footsteps had retreated. She thought about £30 a year, and £60 owed. She thought about 2 years, minimum. She thought about the prospectus still folded in her room, and the second dismissal in the library, and then she thought about the miniature in the lamplight. And then she thought, with a clarity that arrived the way clarity usually arrived in her experience, that it is possible to want something and also to understand with complete certainty that it will not be given to you, and that the dignity available in that situation is to want it clearly, rather than to pretend you do not want it at all, and then to leave, without making it into a scene. She would attend the midsummer ball, because her absence would be noted, and she did not wish to appear to be skulking. She would watch Lady Dorothea's maneuver from the appropriate distance. And she would write her letter of resignation that evening, and arrange her trunk. The midsummer ball opened the long gallery from end to end, and brought in 200 guests, and the 4-piece quartet from the assembly rooms in Exeter, and enough candles to make the room a room from another world, entirely warm and saturated, and excessive, in the way that all great occasions are excessive. Miriam stood near the far doorway in her gray silk, and held a glass of lemonade she was not drinking, and watched Lady Dorothea manage the room from her carved chair. Miss Vane was placed with a precision that bore the marks of considerable planning, near enough to Edmund to suggest familiarity, far enough to maintain propriety, and dressed in white muslin and seed pearls that communicated everything Lady Dorothea wished, communicated without the vulgarity of a statement. Edmund himself stood near the tall windows on the west wall, his back partly to the room, speaking with a man Miriam recognized as the estate's solicitor. He had not looked toward her. She had checked this 3 times, with the diminishing self-respect of someone who knows she is checking and checks anyway. And he had not looked. His face was the organized, closed face. His coat was very fine and very dark, and his hands were at his sides, and he was the Duke of Ashvale in every visible particular, which was to say he was entirely and formally unreachable, and she had been a fool to let the lamplight and the miniature and the morning corridor make her think otherwise. Lady Dorothea said something to Miss Vane. Miss Vane smiled and lowered her fan, and turned toward Edmund with the unhurried grace of someone who has been practicing the entrance for some time. Miriam set down her lemonade on the nearest surface, and decided she was done. She moved toward the side door that led out into the garden corridor, and walked with the even pace of someone leaving rather than retreating, which is a distinction that matters, and that she was very careful about. She was nearly at the door when she heard Lady Dorothea's voice, elevated just slightly above the ambient conversation, bright with the pleasure of a well-timed observation, say to the 2 women nearest to her, "The provincial music teacher." She really ought to have learned by now that these occasions are not intended for the staff. The 2 women said nothing. The fan was at Lady Dorothea's chin. Miriam did not stop. She went through the door. She walked down the garden corridor with her arms at her sides and her chin level and her eyes entirely dry, because she had made a decision about what the next 12 hours looked like, and she intended to hold to it. The letter of resignation took her 20 minutes to compose, not because she could not find the words, but because she found too many of them and had to remove the ones that showed what this place had come to mean to her. The version she placed on her writing desk was 4 sentences. She thanked the Duke of Ashvale for the position. She indicated that family circumstances required her departure. She wished Clara every success, and expressed confidence in her continued progress. She requested that her final month's wages be sent to the address in Bath she had provided toward her brother's school fees. She pulled her portmanteau from under the bed, and opened it on the floor and began to lift her dresses from the wardrobe. She had folded 3 items when she heard a knock at the door. It was not Agnes's knock. Agnes knocked with 2 brisk taps that communicated their own genre. This was a single, deliberate sound. She stood very still for a moment, holding a folded shawl, and then she went to the door and opened it. Edmund Calder was standing in the corridor in his evening coat, with his hands at his sides, and his face was not organized. It was as unguarded as she had ever seen it, and that was the most startling thing about him in that moment, more startling than his being there at all. He said, "Miss Hartley, I was told you had left the ball." He said it as though the sentence was a question he had already answered himself, and was merely confirming. She said, "I had." She held the shawl. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the open portmanteau on the floor behind her, and then at her face, and then briefly at the letter on the writing desk. He said, "You are leaving Ashvale. I had intended to submit my resignation in the morning," she said. "My circumstances have changed." "Your circumstances," he said, and something moved through his voice that she could not identify, something that had the quality of a thing being placed carefully where it would not fall, or your assumptions regarding what this evening was intended to convey. She did not have an answer that was both honest and safe, so she gave him the honest one. "Both," she said. He reached into his coat pocket. He placed the miniature on the edge of the small table beside the door, not his coat pocket. He did not give it to her. He did not explain it. He looked at it for a moment with the expression he had carried at the library table in the lamplight. And then he looked at her and he said, "Evelyn died in childbed 6 years ago. I have spent 6 years believing I chose badly, that the choice was mine to make, and that I made it without sufficient consideration. and that the cost was hers. He paused. I have arranged Clara's position at the school in Bath, Mr. Clast. Larch will confirm it by the end of the week. I sent the letter yesterday. Another pause. I should have said so in the library. I was wrong to dismiss it. The hall was very quiet. Miriam felt her breath slow in the way it slowed when something required her to hold herself steady, so as not to drop it. The fees for your brother's school in Exeter, he said, have been settled with the bursar directly. I have been informed the amount was £60 that is separate from your wages, which will continue. That is not a condition. I want to be clear that it is not a condition of anything. She could not speak for a moment. She did not try. He said, Miriam! Her name in his mouth with no title before it was a small, quiet event. Formal as a ceremony, and intimate as nothing she had, experienced in months. I would ask you to come back to the ball. There is something I intend to say in that room, and I would prefer that you were present in it when I say it. She looked at the portmanteau on the floor, and the letter on the desk, and the miniature on the table beside the door. She looked at his face, which was still unguarded, in a way she now understood cost him something. She said, Give me 5 minutes, and he said, I will wait in the corridor. And she said, You do not need to wait in the corridor. And he said, I will wait in the corridor. And the ghost of something that was not quite a smile arrived at the corner of his mouth for a single unguarded instant, and she was very nearly undone by it, which she filed away for later and did not permit herself. Then she smoothed her gray silk. She went out into the corridor. He walked beside her down the stairs and through the east passage and into the warm, excessive candlelit room, and she was very careful to breathe normally, and she did not succeed entirely. The room noticed their arrival in the way rooms of 200 people notice a shift in weather, a gradual, rippling reorientation of attention that reached Lady Dorothea before they had crossed a third of the distance between the door and the center of the gallery. The dowager's fan descended to her lap. Something crossed her face, very briefly. That might have been calculation or might have been the first motion of understanding, and then it was gone. Miss Vane, to her considerable credit, simply stood where she was and waited, and her expression was the expression of a person who has read the situation correctly and is not going to pretend otherwise. Edmund stopped at a point in the room where he could see both his mother and the greater portion of the assembled guests. He was entirely still in the way. He was still when he meant to be entirely still, and the room quieted around him in the way rooms do around the kind of authority that does not require its own announcement. He said clearly, and without raising his voice, so that the quieted room carried the words where he intended them to go, I would like to present Miss Miriam Hartley, who has taught my ward Clara to play with more honesty and skill than I believed possible in 8 weeks, and who has on 2 occasions told me directly when I was wrong. I have asked her to consider whether she might extend to Ashvale the honor of her permanent residence. I am hopeful she will agree. He said it, looking at her, not at his mother, not at the room at her. The last sentence he said as though the 200 people were an inconvenience he was declining to register, and the relevant audience was entirely and only Miriam. She heard the room. She heard the shift of 200 people taking a breath. At the same moment, she heard Lady Dorothea's fan snap shut. She heard from somewhere behind her Agnes Webb's quiet exhale, carrying in it the satisfaction of a ledger that has been balanced correctly after considerable effort. Miriam looked at Edmund's face, which was still unguarded, and at his hands, at his sides, and she understood that he had crossed not only the length of that ballroom, but also the length of 6 years, and that it had cost him a great deal to stand there unguarded in a room of 200 witnesses. She understood that the correct response was not to make him wait. She said, I am grateful to consider it, Your Grace. And then, because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving the honest thing out, she said, I should tell you that I almost certainly will agree. It was the only moment in the whole evening that he smiled in full without the ghost of a qualification, and the witnesses nearest to them would speak of it afterward, in terms that suggested they had observed something considerable. Lady Dorothea said nothing. She looked at her son for a long time and at Miriam, and something shifted in her bearing that was not collapse, but was the movement of someone standing down from a position that has been rendered untenable. She inclined her head very slightly toward Miriam. The smallest gesture of acknowledgement that still falls within the category of gestures, and Miriam received it with the grace of someone who understood that reckoning and cruelty were not the same thing. Miss Vane asked her companion for a glass of wine, and turned her attention to the south window, and she was not unkind about it. And later she danced with a Wiltshire baronet who seemed entirely delighted with her. And Miriam thought, watching them briefly, that things often work out as they should when the first plan is shown to have been wrong. Agnes Webb appeared at Miriam's elbow near the supper table at 11 o'clock, and pressed a small glass of wine into her hand and said, "There," with the finality of a woman closing an account book, and then moved away to manage the footman. The autumn came and went. Clara went to Bath in September, 2 weeks into the autumn term, with a trunk of new music she had helped select, and a letter from Miriam to the school's director, describing her progress in specific terms. She wrote to Miriam every fortnight without fail. The letters were careful and full of observations about the other girls and the instrument's action and the way the practice room windows looked over the city in the morning, and Miriam read each one twice. Silas came home from Exeter for Christmas, with his fees paid and his debts cleared, and a new coat he had not expected, and he sat in the great kitchen at Ashvale, which he had been expressly invited to do by the new mistress of the house. And he ate Agnes's gingerbread, and he said, "You look different," to his sister, and Miriam said, "I am different." And he said, "Good," and ate another piece of gingerbread. When Miriam asked, later that evening, how different she looked, Agnes said without pausing from her work, "Less like someone waiting for the next difficulty." And that seemed to Miriam to be adequate. The evening she thinks of first when she thinks of Ashvale in winter is not the ball, and not the corridor, and not the words he said in the quieted room, though she returns to all of those. The evening she thinks of first is a January one, 2 weeks after the New Year, when the snow that had been threatening since morning finally came down in the early dark, heavy and straight, and entirely committed to its purpose, coating the formal parterre and the garden walls and the road south in a single uninterrupted white. She was standing at the long window in the drawing-room, her forehead not quite touching the glass, watching it fall. The fire behind her was very good and very warm. Clara's most recent letter was on the side table beside her chair, open where she had left it. Edmund came in from the library, crossing the room with the quiet efficiency that had ceased to read as coldness some months ago, and he came to stand beside her at the window. He did not speak for a moment. They stood together and watched the snow come down over the garden. He reached into his coat pocket. He held the miniature in his palm for a moment, and then he said, "I have been thinking that it ought to be in the gallery." With the other portraits he paused. "She would not have wanted me to carry her as a weight." He said it to the snow and the dark beyond the window, not entirely to Miriam. And she understood that this was the nature of some things, that they need to be said in the direction of the window rather than directly, and that this is not a failure of courage, but a different kind of it. She did not offer a word for it. She put her hand over his briefly, the one holding the miniature, and then she let it rest there. And the snow kept coming down over the parterre and the lamp glow from the east gate, straight and steady and without urgency. In the morning they would have the portrait placed in the gallery, between the window and the old painting of the east garden in summer, and it would hang there quietly and belong there. But that was morning. For now there was only the fire and the snow and the window and the house around them. Very warm and entirely theirs. If Miriam's story has moved you, leave a word below. There are more stories like this one waiting, and your company in this room is what keeps them coming.